Nice to see you again. Our last few lectures took us to the foundations of European modernity, and I'm guessing that was a fairly familiar space. But what we're going to do now is to destabilize that space a little bit. We're going to begin to look at critical evaluations of the modernism that most of us take for granted. Today we're going to focus on the critique developed by the great Russian novelist and philosopher Lev Tolstoy. Most of us, of course, think of Tolstoy, who was born in 1828, died in 1910, as a great novelist. And of course, he was a great novelist. He wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and so forth. But he was also a very important social reformer and political activist in Russia. He was a religious reformer. He was indeed even a supporter of anarchism. And a lot of Tolstoy's political and moral thought was in fact influential on the great Indian leader Mohandas Gandhi, whose work we'll address later, and through Gandhi on the great American political leader and philosopher Martin Luther King. So in our own culture, we owe a lot of ideas that are current to Tolstoy. Tolstoy was radical in that he was one of the first Russian landowners to provide education to his serfs, and near his death moved to liberate them. And he tried very hard to make the Christianity of his time less ritualistic and more humanistic. Late in his life, very late in his life, he resolved to become an ascetic wanderer on the model of the Buddha and left home but died very shortly afterwards. Even Tolstoy's novels are intensely philosophical, and we will be reading one of his novels, a very short novel, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which I think is especially philosophical. I also think it's especially beautiful. But why are we reading a Tolstoy novel now? Well, it's because Tolstoy was, above all, intensely concerned about the dangers of modernity for human life and spiritual life. In particular, Tolstoy thought that secularization, which is, as we have seen, is a centerpiece of European modernity, and the mass society that results from secularization coupled with capitalism, lead to a meaningless life. He thought that they evacuated all sense of value, everything that was worthwhile from life. In The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy takes as his theme the importance of coming back to what he regards as a pre-modern value, spiritual values, including an awareness of death, a value on important, deep human relationships, and above all, a connection to nature as opposed to a connection to an artificial society. Tolstoy thought and argues implicitly in The Death of Ivan Ilyich that a life that's led in a secular world, that's governed entirely by social conventions and laws, like Hume imagines, right? A life that is governed by our collective social energy, or governed by reason even, and public discourse, like those imagined by Kant and Mill. He thinks that such a life, this kind of secular life with religion pushed off to the side, lived in this public sphere, is absolutely hopeless, and that at death, it leaves us completely empty and feeling as though we've wasted our lives. So for Tolstoy, Ivan Ilyich, who we're going to encounter in the last moments of his life, is indeed all of us. Tolstoy wants us to pay attention to Ivan Ilyich's life because Tolstoy thinks that that's the life that most of us lead, and that his death is the death that we are most in danger of dying. Tolstoy's prose in this novel, as in all of his novels, is absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to do a fair amount of reading the text with you and talking through the philosophical ideas in the text. I'm hoping that after this you run out and buy it, because it's a really absolutely lovely little novel. So let's begin by asking what Ivan Ilyich's death meant to those around us. And Tolstoy opens with a lovely scene involving Ivan Ilyich's colleagues, people with whom he'd been on very close terms and who had known that he was ill, and their conjectures on Ivan Ilyich's death. Ivan Ilyich, by the way, was a judge at the time of his death, so his colleagues are other colleagues in the law and the judiciary. Tolstoy writes, "His post had been kept open for him, but there had been conjectures that in case of his death, Alexeyev might receive his appointment, and that either Vinnikov or Stabel would succeed Alexeyev. So on receiving the news of Ivan Ilyitch's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen in that private room was of the changes and promotions it might occasion among themselves or their acquaintances. So what's going on here? Ivan Ilyitch has died. What does this death mean to the friends and colleagues who were so close to him? Well, we're beginning with his friends. What it means to them, of course, is there's a vacancy. And we've got to start thinking in the shop about who's going to fill that vacancy. But of course, it means a bit more than that, Tolstoy writes. The mere fact of the death of a near acquaintance aroused, as usual, in all who heard of it, the complacent feeling that it is he who is dead, not I. This is a very important philosophical moment in this text. Which of us, when we've heard that somebody else died, thought, wow, I dodged a bullet, he's dead, not me. It's sad, I'm worried about it, but I've got to go on living. And so we push the thought of our own death away when we encounter the deaths of others. Recall Shantideva on this, how much of our life is spent pushing the thought of our own death away. Tolstoy continues, but the more intimate of Ilyitch's acquaintances, his so-called friends, could not help thinking that they would now have to fulfill the very tiresome demands of propriety by attending the funeral service and paying a visit of condolence to the widow. We might be embarrassed by this, but it's certainly familiar. The idea that we think, damn, I've got other things to do. I've got a life to lead. And now this person's died. It's so inconvenient. I've got to go to a funeral. I've got to make a condolence call. So one of the things that death does to us is to force us to think for a moment about our own death and suppress it. And the other, to develop this kind of annoyed view that somebody had the temerity to die and screw up our lives right now. So this is what Tolstoy is suggesting, that death often in modern society means to the friends. But how about to Ivan Ilyitch's wife, who after all is much closer to him? We're now in a conversation between Ivan Ilyitch's wife and one of these friends. And she says, he suffered terribly in the last few days. He screamed unceasingly, not for minutes, but for hours. It wasn't a good death, by the way. For the last 3 days, he screamed unceasingly. Now listen, it was unendurable. I cannot understand how I bore it. You could hear him 3 rooms off. Oh, what I have suffered. Listen to Ivan Ilyitch's wife. Ivan Ilyitch has just died this horrible death, and she's told us how painful it was for him and how much he suffered. But it moves immediately to how much I suffered, how much she could not bear. Tolstoy's emphasizing here the idea that when somebody else dies, we immediately focus not on them, but we personalize it. What does it mean to me? How do I feel now? We focus on our own mourning, our own upset. And for Tolstoy, this is just an indication of the kind of alienation from each other that death brings into focus, an alienation that he thinks is born of the secular modernity. Tolstoy now asks, what does his death mean to all of us? Taking it through the soliloquy of one of Ivan Ilyitch's friends. He writes, 3 days of frightful suffering and death. Why, that might suddenly, at any time, happen to me, he thought, and for a moment he felt terrified. But he did not know how. The customary reflection at once occurred to him that this had happened to Ivan Ilyitch and not to him, and that it should not and could not happen to him, and to think that it could would be yielding to depression, which he ought not to do. After this reflection, Peter Ivanovitch felt reassured. Death was an accident natural to Ivan Ilyitch, but certainly not to himself. Once again, Tolstoy eloquently paints for us what happens when we contemplate the death of another. We immediately realize that it was he who died, not me. We immediately decide that thinking about our own death, however natural it might be now, would be depressing. Push it aside. Think about other things. Better to lead our lives in ignorance of our own mortality than to focus on that depressing fact. This all sounds pretty real, right? Remember Shantideva's worry that this is our natural condition. Death appears to be a really big thing to us. But to those who remain behind, Ivan Ilyitch's friends, for instance, it's just a reshuffling. One person is gone, other people take the jobs. It's a set of rituals and social obligations. The dead person, Ivan Ilyitch in this case, slips out of consciousness. Nobody's thinking about him We think about our own grief and about whether or not this death means anything to us. And finally, we deny that that death has any relationship to ourselves. Death becomes abstract. This depersonalization of death, this abstraction of death, is very much how we often deal with our own mortality and with the mortality of others. That's Tolstoy's point. The depersonalization and abstraction is an inevitable consequence of a secularism and a modernity. So who is Ivan Ilyich, whose death we're talking about? Well, Tolstoy points out to us, he's all of us. He writes, Ivan Ilyich's life had been most simple and most ordinary, and therefore most terrible. This is an indictment, not a celebration of modernity. This is not Hume or Mill. This is a very different view. Tolstoy tells us that Ivan Ilyich had a kind of model career. When he died as a judge at the age of 45, he'd done very well for himself. He joined the civil service after graduating from law school. He got a good post as an aide to a governor of a province. Tolstoy explains to us he was a very decent man. He was proper. He was absolutely scrupulous in his duties, nothing corrupt about him. He was honest. He was well respected. We're told that he was a man of great personal decorum and a man of good cheer. We're also told he had a really nice wife and good children. Like so many of us, Ivan Ilyich, we find out in the novel, has some financial troubles and there's some marital squabbling. But after a while, he gets a big promotion to this judgeship. And then the financial troubles go away. Everybody's happy. He buys a really nice house that Ivan Ilyich thinks is really spiffy, but it's a kind of McMansion. It's just like everybody else's house. All the houses that are owned and decorated by the upper middle classes in Russia, Tolstoy tells us, look about the same, and Ivan Ilyich is like that, a Russian McMansion. But nonetheless, he has a happy life. We're told he throws good parties, people really enjoy them and look for invitations. He holds bridge nights with his good friends. He enjoys lots of food and drink. He has a very satisfying job as a judge. He does it well. It's not just an imagination. And he enjoys doing it well. He's very well respected socially. He has a lot of material comfort. He's an upper middle class kind of guy. The kids are doing great in school. This is a really good life. This is the modern life. This is the life Tolstoy thinks to which most of us aspire. A really good house, a really good job, a nice wife, good kids who are doing well, a fulfilling job, lots of respect, all that good stuff. But then Ivan Ilyich gets sick. And as soon as he gets sick, we start worrying. First, Ivan Ilyich is thinking about his own death, realizing that it might be serious. And he begins to contemplate what that means. And notice how abstract things get. Ivan Ilyich writes, this is now Ivan Ilyich's voice. When I am not, what will there be? There will be nothing. And then where shall I be when I am no more? Can this be dying? No, I don't want to. It's impossible that all men have been doomed to suffer this awful horror. What does this mean? Ivan Ilyich is suddenly realizing at this stage of his death, of his illness, that he might die. And the first thing he does is to deny it. He says, it can't be so. Death is just too bad. This can't be something that we have been sentenced to. And then he considers this wonderful syllogism. And this is a beautiful exposition by Tolstoy of how we manage to abstract death and depersonalize it. Tolstoy writes, the syllogism he had learned in logic. Caius is a man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal, had always seemed correct to him as applied to Caius, but certainly not as applied to himself. That Caius, man in the abstract, was mortal was perfectly correct. But he was not Caius, not an abstract man, but a creature quite separate from all others. He had been little Vanya with a mama and a papa. What did Caius know of the smell of that striped ball Vanya had been so fond of? Had Caius been in love like that? Could Caius preside at a session as he did? Caius really was mortal, and it was right for him to die. But for me, little Vanya, Ivan Ilyich, with all my thoughts and emotions, it's altogether a different matter. So Tolstoy points out, we are quite happy understanding that death happens to everybody. We're quite happy with an abstract understanding of our mortality. But we always fail to see that we fall under that abstraction, that death happens to us too. It's part of this depersonalization that Tolstoy sees is part of secularization. But unfortunately for Ivan Ilyich, his illness is far too concrete. It can't be all made abstract. We learn that he starts having trouble sleeping. The doctors come, he's given opium for the pain and to help him sleep. He's giving injections of morphine, but even this doesn't relieve the pain. We're told that he has a special diet prepared for him at doctor's orders. And for a while, that's a little bit better. But eventually, the foods become really distasteful and disgusting to him. He loses his appetite, and, he's going downhill. And Tolstoy writes, really emphasizing the concreteness of all of this. For his excretions also, special arrangements had to be made, and this was a torment to him every time. A torment from the uncleanliness, the unseemliness, and the smell, and from knowing that another person had to take part in it. Let's pause on this for a moment. This, I think, even though it seems like a kind of earthy moment, is for Tolstoy a philosophically very significant moment in the novel. What's upsetting to Ivan Ilyich is his embodiment, and the fact that he has to be, as a physical person, who actually excretes smelly stuff, involved with another person. Because somebody has to come and clean him up and take the bedpan out and all of that. And so for Ivan Ilyich, what happens at this kind of moment, having to do with food, with excretion, with physical care, brings the concreteness of his life, brings the concreteness of his illness, brings the concreteness of his death really home to roost. And that's why it's so upsetting. It forces him to confront that kind of reality. So where are we at this point in the text? What we find is that we've got a very nice guy. There's nothing wrong with Ivan Ilyich. He's a very good, very ordinary person with a good, ordinary middle-class life. He's doing all the right things in life, and he's confronting his own mortality in the way that each of us will someday have to confront our own mortality. He tries to do it by abstraction and by denial, through the syllogism, through thinking that death is a perfectly general thing, through denying that it could possibly be true that he's really dying. But life and death, as Tolstoy points out, turn out to be rather concrete. They're realities that we can't abstract away, that we can't depersonalize. Moreover, Ivan Ilyich is turning out to be rather alone in all of this. This is something else that Tolstoy emphasizes about the nature of death. While we might live among colleagues, we might live among family, eventually we die alone. And Tolstoy points out that especially in this kind of secularized life, people begin to move away from us as we're dying. They visit less often. They spend less time with us at that time. And Ivan Ilyich is getting rather lonely. And in fact, Tolstoy points out, by this time, when we get to this stage of the novel, and the stage of the illness, Ivan Ilyich's family is actually getting bored. The kids don't like having a dying father around. The wife doesn't like having her social life disrupted. There's a lot of inconvenience. There have to be special physical arrangements made. Rooms have to be readjusted. Doctors are going in and out. And we're in a time before universal health care. It's getting expensive. And the wife is worried about the money rolling out to pay for medicines, to pay for doctors, and so forth. So everybody in the family is really feeling like this is a grand annoyance. This is, again, part of the loneliness of death. For Ivan Ilyich, what's happening is this unique and incomprehensible tragedy that affects him and him alone. To his family, it's just one more annoyance. Can't we get it over with? Can't we just lead normal lives? And again, as we read the novel and experience all of this, there's a sense maybe of a kind of compassion or a sense of even contempt for his family and his friends, but there's more of a sense of embarrassment, I think. And the sense of embarrassment comes from the fact that probably each of us at some point has reacted, even if we didn't like to admit it, to a death or an illness in exactly this way. But at this point, Tolstoy introduces a new character into the novel, who turns out to be a significant one. I'm going to read with you. But just through this most unpleasant matter, that is the matter of toileting, Ivan Ilyich obtained comfort. Gerasim, the butler's assistant, always came in to carry the things out. Gerasim was a clean, fresh peasant lad, always cheerful and bright. At first, the sight of him in his clean clothes, engaged on that disgusting task, embarrassed Ivan Ilyich. So what happens? We have this kind of sweet, clean, fresh peasant guy coming in and helping Ivan Ilyich with his bedpan and cleaning him up and so forth. And Ivan Ilyich's first reaction to this interaction is serious embarrassment. He doesn't want this boy to see him in this situation and to deal with these functions. And, you can understand the embarrassment. But things continue. Gerasim turns out to be an uncommonly kind lad. So let's see how Tolstoy puts this. He says, Gerasim went up to him, grasped his master with his strong arms deftly but gently, lifted him, supported him with one, and with the other drew up his trousers. Thank you, how easily and well you do it all. That's the voice of Ivan Ilyich, of course. Gerasim smiled again and turned to leave the room. But Ivan Ilyich felt his presence such a comfort that he did not want him to go. And then Tolstoy describes how he had Gerasim stay and hold his legs up so that he'd feel more comfortable, massage him a little bit, talk to him a little bit. And Gerasim actually provided some concrete, personal, tender human comfort. And Gerasim, we find out, had this wonderful effect on Ivan Ilyich. We're told that Gerasim did it all easily, willingly. Tolstoy writes, simply and with a good nature that touched Ivan Ilyich. Health, strength, and vitality in other people were offensive to him, but Gerasim's strength and vitality did not mortify, but soothed him. So there's something about Gerasim that can provide some comfort. And what we're seeing is possible is that Gerasim, in a very unpretentious, very natural, human way, not out of obligation, not out of some social convention, but just naturally and spontaneously, engages at this personal level with Ivan Ilyich. Operating in the private sphere gives a certain kind of comfort. And Gerasim is honest in a way that others are not. Ivan Ilyich saw, Tolstoy tells us, that nobody else really felt for him. Nobody else really had serious, deep compassion for him in his illness and impending death. For one reason, nobody even wanted to grasp his position. Nobody really understood what he was going through, and that because it was so annoying or so depressing or so terrifying that everybody distanced themselves. It was only Gerasim who recognized and pitied him. Here's how Tolstoy puts it in Gerasim's mouth now. So we hear Gerasim, the butler's boy, talking. If you weren't sick, it would be another matter. But as it is, why should I grudge a little trouble? Gerasim alone did not lie. Everything showed that he alone understood the facts of the case and did not consider it necessary to disguise them. Once he even said straight out, this is an important moment in the novel and an important philosophical moment for Tolstoy. This is the voice of Gerasim, the butler's boy. We shall all of us die, so why should I grudge a little trouble? He did not think his work burdensome because he was doing it for a dying man and hoped that someone would do the same for him when his time came. So Gerasim's an interesting character in all of this. Gerasim understands the inevitability of death and the meaningfulness of death, not just in the abstract, but also in this very concrete sense. What does Gerasim represent in this case? Well, part of Gerasim's role is to represent the peasant for Tolstoy, because Tolstoy, we have to face it, was a kind of peasant romantic. He really thought there was a special, deep kind of wisdom in the Russian peasant to which modern Russians really needed to tap into. This kind of depth and understanding of nature that was absent from the upper classes. There is part of that. But there is a deeper point. Gerasim takes his own death seriously. He says, we all of us die. He speaks in the first person. When Ivan Ilyich thought about death, he thought about it in the third person. Caius is mortal. He abstracted it from himself. When his friends thought about death, they thought about it as something that happened to Ivan Ilyich, but can't possibly happen to them. But Gerasim talks about death in the first person, and he's the only person in the novel who's doing that. He says, we all of us die. And Tolstoy's point here is that only somebody who takes their own death seriously can be honest with somebody else about death. So that if we want to be able to encounter other people in their mortality and to be able to understand the nature of their lives and to engage in meaningful interactions with them, even for their own benefit, but for ours as well, taking our own mortality and our own death seriously is an important prerequisite. The other point here that, of course, follows from this and is the real punch is that only if you're honest about death can you live. Only if you're honest about death can you live a healthy, happy life. That's really central to all of this. Remember all these facts about Gerasim. He's clean, he's happy, he's healthy, he's cheerful, he's able to be a comfort. That's because of his honesty about his own life and his own death. And this is a theme that we saw developed in Shantideva, of course. This isn't a modern theme, it's a way pre-modern theme. Shantideva argued that what makes our lives miserable, what causes us to live in fear, unhappiness, and vice, is not just the fear of death, but pushing death to the periphery of our understanding and of our experience. But if we're happy with death and can accept death and our own mortality, the fear disappears. Now we find ourselves very close to Ivan Ilyitch's death, and we have the question asked, what if his life wasn't the real thing? Tolstoy writes, all that had seemed joys now melted before his sight and turned into something trivial and often nasty. That is, Ivan Ilyitch is reviewing his life, and everything that seemed like it was wonderful, the house, the kids, the wife, the promotion, suddenly seem really trivial, because now he's really confronting his mortality. Death is important. The rest of this stuff pales. And what that means is he's finding himself at the end of a life thinking that everything that happened in it was trivial and often nasty. Tolstoy continues, and the further he departed from childhood and the nearer he came to the present, the more worthless and doubtful were the joys. It is as if I had been going downhill while I imagined I was going up. And that is really what it was. I was going up in public opinion, but to the same extent, life was ebbing away from me, and now it is all done, and there is only death. Ivan Ilyitch has suddenly recognized that he's frittered his life away on the trivial, on the public sphere, on a conventional life, an ordinary life, a life that was lived thoughtlessly, a life where he wasn't confronting his own choices and he wasn't confronting the structure of his own existence. Then what does it mean? It can't be that life is so senseless and horrible. But of course, that's the problem. If we lead a life in which we abstract ourselves so much and pay so little attention to the concrete reality of our existence and our own mortality, a senseless and horrible life is what we might be left with. Might it have all been false? That night, the question suddenly occurred to him. What if my whole life has been wrong? Imagine having to ask yourself that on your deathbed. Tolstoy's point is that we may all be in exactly that position if we don't move to lead a more authentic, meaningful life now. It occurred to him that what had appeared perfectly impossible before, namely that he had not spent